The architecture of a built on a foundation of well-crafted silence, but the survival of an elite legacy requires a much more terrifying design. When you look at the towering iron gates of the wealthy, you see security, prestige, and power. You do not see the monsters waiting inside the shadows, wearing the exact faces of the people you love most. For nearly 12 years, my life within the massive, wrought iron security gates of the Vance estate, overlooking the frosted, dark waters of the Charles River in Boston, was the ultimate envy of New England's high society. My husband, David Vance, was a brilliant, predatory hedge fund tycoon whose cold, calculating mind was celebrated on the front pages of international financial magazines. He was a man who moved markets with a single text message, a titan of Wall Street who viewed human beings as numbers on a ledger. I, Clara, had dedicated my entire existence to maintaining the pristine elegance, the flawless social calendar, and the untouchable reputation of our family name. We were a modern power couple, flawless on the outside, immaculate in public, and completely hollow within. The first catastrophic fracture in our false truth didn't come from a sudden market collapse, a corporate whistleblower, or a scandalous hotel room affair. It arrived in the back of an emergency medical transport vehicle on a bleak, foggy Tuesday morning, wrapped in heavy sterile blankets and a chilling, unrecognizable quietness. 3 weeks prior, David's private corporate jet had vanished from radar screens, cutting off all communication with air traffic control while navigating a severe, historic winter storm over the jagged, sub-zero mountains of the Alaskan wilderness. For 21 agonizing days, my world was plunged into a pitch-black abyss of grief, panic, and intense media scrutiny. The national press fixated on the rescue mission, flashing David's powerful television screen across America. The federal authorities privately told me to prepare for a recovery mission rather than a rescue. They insisted no human being could survive that frozen wasteland without immediate shelter or food. My tears had dried into a state of numb, wealthy despair, and our historic colonial mansion felt like a massive, empty mausoleum. And then, against every mathematical and biological probability, a miracle occurred. David was discovered alive by a local wilderness tracker in a remote, snow-blind valley. He was the sole survivor of a horrific crash that had instantly claimed the lives of his pilot, co-pilot, and 2 of his closest senior investment partners. But when he stepped off that medical helicopter and finally returned to our private estate, refusing to look directly into the eyes of the welcoming staff, I felt a sudden, icy shiver run straight down my spine. Looking at the strange, distant glint, I realized right then that this miracle carried a very toxic price. The man who came back out of the ice was not the man I had said goodbye to 3 weeks before. Within 3 weeks of his miraculous return, the man who wore my husband's face had integrated himself back into the daily rhythm of the Vance estate with a terrifying, calculated efficiency. He returned to our Beacon Hill mansion with deep physical lacerations across his high cheekbones, severe frostbite scars covering his fingertips, and an unsettling, hollow quietness that didn't belong to the charismatic, commanding man I had married. My husband had always been a dominant force, a man whose loud laughter filled a room and whose presence demanded immediate attention from everyone. This man was a shadow, walking through our high-ceilinged corridors like a ghost inspecting an unfamiliar museum. He spent hours staring out the grand windows at the falling snow, his body rigid, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture David had never used. The medical team at Boston's most exclusive private hospital had pulled me aside in the sterile corridor before his official discharge. They explained, with absolute clinical authority, that he was suffering from a profound, textbook case of post-traumatic stress disorder. They warned me that his behavior, his emotional demeanor, his memory recall, and even small, deeply ingrained daily habits might drastically change as his brain attempted to cope with the sheer trauma of wilderness survival. "Do not push him for answers, Mrs. Vance," the lead psychiatrist had told me, his voice soft and cautious. "The brain does incredible things to protect itself from horrific memories. He might forget names, he might alter his routine, he might even seem like a completely different person. Give him time. The familiarity of home will eventually bring him back. I chose compassion over suspicion. I believed holding him close every single night in our master bed, feeling the frantic, irregular beat of his heart against my chest, promising myself I would do whatever it took to help him reclaim his life and his shattered identity. When he woke up screaming from nightmares, his body drenched in cold sweat, I would comfort him, whispering that he was safe, that the wilderness couldn't touch him anymore. But even during those dark hours, I noticed a strange coldness in his embrace. He held me not like a husband holding his wife, but like a man clinging to a life raft in open water. But the fractures in our reality began to peel at the edges during his second week back in the estate, starting with a routine corporate matter that disrupted the perfect symmetry of our household. The senior legal team from David's investment firm brought over a massive stack of high-level, confidential asset transfer documents to our private study. These papers were critical. They required his personal, handwritten authorization to restructure a major hedge fund portfolio before the fiscal year ended. The financial future of our entire legacy depended on those signatures. David sat at his heavy, dark mahogany desk, surrounded by the familiar luxury of old leather books, crystal decanters, and the expensive tobacco scent of his past. As the head attorney explained the complex terms of the transfer, David reached out his arm, unscrewed his vintage gold fountain pen, and began writing, with his left hand. Without a single second of hesitation, awkwardness, or muscle memory resistance, his left hand glided across the legal documents, executing a flawless, sweeping signature. I stood completely frozen in the doorway, the heavy silver tray of coffee in my hands suddenly trembling, the porcelain cups rattling against each other. My David was a fierce, lifelong right-handed man. He had suffered a minor neurological coordination defect in his left arm during childhood. A coffee mug, a tennis racket, or a steak knife properly with his left hand, let alone execute a complex corporate signature under the watchful eyes of his legal team. When the lawyers finally gathered their papers, thanked him, and left the room, the silence that followed was suffocating. I walked over to the desk, looking at the fresh ink. When I questioned him about it, he couldn't lie. He froze for a split second, his eyes darting to the floor before locking onto mine with an unreadable, flat intensity. I saw a thick, tense muscle in his jaw clenched tightly under his skin. Then, he forced a weary, practiced smile and looked at me. I suffered severe nerve damage in my right shoulder during the fuselage impact, sweetheart. The emergency medical team in Alaska told me I have to train my left hand for the next few months to give the right side a chance to fully heal. It's frustrating, but it's the only way I can keep working. The explanation sounded backed by medical science and the brutal reality of a plane crash. But a wife's twin's instinct, the kind that cannot be fooled by words, told me that the hidden architecture of our perfect life was beginning to crack. The suspicion grew heavier over the next few days, turning into a constant, low-frequency paranoia that followed me through the empty, echoing corridors of our mansion. An active investigation wasn't my intention at first. It was born from small, jarring anomalies that disrupted the symmetry of my daily routine. I found myself watching him from corners, analyzing the way he walked, the way he poured his scotch, and the way he looked at our family photos with a cold, analytical detachment rather than nostalgia. He didn't know the names of our domestic staff. When Maria, our housekeeper of 8 years, asked him how he preferred his morning eggs, he hesitated, looking at her with a blank stare before saying, "Just black coffee." David had always insisted on a massive, protein-heavy breakfast. When our 5-year-old son, Leo, ran into the room to show him a drawing, the man placed a stiff, awkward hand on the boy's shoulder, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Leo looked up at him, confused, and slowly pulled away. Children know when a stranger is wearing their father's clothes. A few days later, while David was taking a long, steaming shower to ease his muscle pains, I went into his walk-in dressing room to prepare his evening tuxedo for an upcoming corporate gala. Through the thick, frosted glass of the master bathroom, I could hear the steady, rhythmic hum of running water and see the blurred silhouette of his body. When the water stopped, he finally stepped out into the steam, a black silk towel wrapped loosely around his waist. As he wiped the heavy condensation off the vanity mirror, my eyes immediately locked onto his right shoulder blade. The skin there was smooth, pale, and unblemished. The flesh was pristine, save for a few fading scratches and minor purple bruises from the recent wilderness crash. When he was 18 years old, David had survived a brutal horse-riding accident at his family's country ranch. The injury had been severe, requiring over 20 deep stitches and leaving a massive, jagged, highly distinct keloid scar across his right shoulder blade. It was rough to the touch, a permanent genetic signature of his youth, a mark I had touched thousands of times in the quiet dark of our bedroom over the last 10 years. I stepped forward into the bathroom, my hand trembling, my voice barely a whisper as I reached out to touch his bare, smooth skin. "David, your scar from the riding accident, where is it?" "The one on your shoulder." He meticulously avoided making eye contact with me in the mirror, turning his back quickly to hide the skin from my view. He reached for a high-collared cashmere suit tightly up to his neck to cover every inch of his upper body. The trauma surgeons in the Alaskan field hospital had to perform extensive, emergency skin grafting and microreconstruction to salvage the deep tissue damage caused by the twisted metal debris of the jet, he said, his voice flat, completely devoid of emotion. They cleared out the old keloid scar tissue while they were operating on the open wound. I told them it didn't matter, as long as they saved the arm. An emergency field hospital in the middle of a sub-zero wilderness survival crisis performing intricate cosmetic scar reconstruction. The false truth of our peaceful household was beginning to peel at the edges, revealing the first glimpses of a hidden, calculated architecture underneath. I knew I had to find the truth before this stranger destroyed everything I loved. I left the bathroom without saying another word, but my hands were cold with terror. To celebrate David's miraculous reassure the nervous Wall Street investors who controlled the financial fate of the Vance empire, our family hosted a lavish, high-society dinner party at our estate. The primary shareholders, corporate board members, city politicians, and Boston's elite filled our grand dining room. The room was a monument to old-money luxury, illuminated by massive crystal chandeliers, with a dining table curated by Michelin-starred chefs. The conversation was loud, filled with the clinking of crystal glasses and talk of market trends, hedge funds, and political favors. The man sitting at the head of the table looked every bit the part of David Vance. He wore a bespoke Italian suit, smiled at the correct times, and spoke with a deep, authoritative voice about the firm's future strategies. He handled questions about his time in the wilderness with a practiced, dramatic humility that captivated the room. It was a test of human endurance, he told the CEO of a major, leaning forward and swirling his wine. When you are alone in the dark, with nothing but the wind and the cold, you find out who you truly are. I watched him from across the table, my eyes never leaving his face. I noticed that while his voice sounded like David's, his cadence was slightly different. He paused in places David would never pause. He laughed a fraction of a second too late. In the middle of the dinner, as classical music played softly from hidden speakers, the servers presented the final course of the evening, a signature royal chocolate tart, beautifully garnished with a heavy dusting of crushed, roasted peanuts. Before I could even open my mouth to speak, before I could scream across the long table to stop him, David picked up his silver spoon, scooped up a massive piece of the peanut-covered dessert, and put it directly into his mouth. He chewed it calmly, swallowed it, took a slow sip of water, and continued laughing at a senior corporate board member sitting right next to him. He was completely unbothered, enjoying the sweet taste without a single hint of discomfort or physical reaction. My breath caught completely in my throat. The air left my lungs, and the room seemed to spin. The crystal wine glass in my hand began to vibrate so violently that the dark red Cabernet Sauvignon sloshed against the rim, staining my white dress and my fingers like blood. David had a lethal, anaphylactic allergy to peanuts since the very day he was born. Even a microscopic trace of peanut dust on a plate was enough to trigger immediate respiratory failure, massive throat swelling, and cardiac arrest within 4 minutes. It was a fiercely guarded family secret, known only to me, his mother, and our private family physician to protect his corporate image from any signs of vulnerability. Yet, the man sitting at the head of my table, wearing my husband's bespoke suit, wearing his wedding ring, was ordinary sugar. He wasn't David. A completely silent, dangerous intruder was sitting in my husband's chair, pretending to love me, pretending to be the father of my child. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The man I had been sleeping next to for the past 3 weeks was a complete ghost, an actor playing a deadly game. I didn't scream, down into tears or cause a chaotic scene in front of Boston's elite. I knew the rules of the high-stakes world we lived in. If I stood up and accused him of being an imposter right there without a single shred of physical evidence, with the immense financial backing, public sympathy, and corporate power of the man currently acting as David, he would easily destroy me. He would hire expensive corporate crisis lawyers, claim I was suffering from a psychological nervous breakdown, or declare that the trauma of his crash had made me clinically paranoid. They would have me locked away in a private psychiatric sanitarium before the night was over, and I would lose my son forever. I didn't need a public scene. I needed unshakable, cold, scientific proof. When the dinner party finally ended, I smiled at the guests, thanked them for coming, and played the part of the dutiful, happy wife. I walked upstairs with the imposter. He went into the master bedroom, complaining of exhaustion from the social interaction. "You played your part beautifully tonight, Clara," he said, his voice low as he unbuttoned his dress shirt. "The investors are happy. The stock price will recover tomorrow." "I did it for the family, David," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady, though my heart was hammering so loudly I was afraid he could hear it. I waited in the dressing room until I heard his breathing change, deepening into the rhythmic pattern of a man in a profound sleep. The clock on the wall read 2:14 a.m. The mansion was wrapped in a suffocating, heavy silence. It was time to begin my active investigation. I slipped out from under the heavy silk blankets of the guest bed I had claimed, ensuring my movements were entirely silent against the polished hardwood floor. I crept into David's private bathroom, the cold marble freezing my bare feet. In my throat as I approached his personal silver-bristled hairbrush resting on the vanity. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely control them. Using a pair of sanitized tweezers from my makeup kit, I carefully extracted 4 thick, dark strands of hair from the bristles, making absolutely sure the white root bulbs, the crucial source of cellular DNA, were entirely intact. I slid them into a clean, sterile plastic Ziploc bag hidden in my robe. Next, I crept down the long, echoing hallway into the bedroom of our 5-year-old son, Leo. The moonlight filtered through the large windows, casting long, monstrous shadows across the floor. I opened his door slowly, the hinges making a faint creak that made me freeze for 10 agonizing seconds. Leo was sleeping peacefully under his blankets, completely innocent of the living nightmare unfolding around him. I approached his bed, leaned down, kissed his forehead. With utmost care, I brushed his hair and snagged 3 strands directly from the root, placing them into a second plastic bag. The human eye could be deceived by a face, a voice, or a smile, but the molecular code of life could not lie. I had the biological samples. Now, I needed to check the final piece of the puzzle within the house itself. The next morning, I stood by the second-story window, hidden behind the heavy velvet drapes, until the black Mercedes cleared the security gates. The moment the imposter left the estate for a mandatory, all-day board meeting at the downtown financial firm, I knew my window of opportunity was small. I had to move fast, before the household staff began their deep cleaning routines. I hurried down to the mansion's high-security basement, where our private legal, financial, and medical archives were stored behind a reinforced, heavy oak door. This basement was designed to protect the family's most sensitive secrets from corporate espionage. I approached the electronic keypad on the wall, my fingers trembling as I entered the complex digital combination into the heavy, fireproof wall safe. The safe door clicked, a heavy mechanical sound that felt incredibly loud in the empty basement. As the thick steel door swung open silently, I reached for the very back of the top shelf, pulling out David's original medical folder and his multi-million-dollar life insurance policy. My plan was simple. I wanted to find his certified fingerprint cards and his historical dental charting from our family. Dentist. If I could get those, I could compare his official records against the crystal whiskey glass he had left on his desk the night before. But when I pulled the heavy leather binder open, my blood turned to ice. The entire official page containing David's biometric data, his fingerprint registry, and his historical dental charting had been clean sliced out of the binder with a razor blade. The edges of the remaining paper were sharp and precise. Someone had gone into our private, secure safe and systematically erased David's biological footprint from his own home. Panic seized my chest, making it hard to breathe. I dropped the empty leather binder to the floor, the sound echoing off the cold concrete walls. This wasn't just a basic identity theft. Whoever this man was, he had access to our most private spaces. He knew the safe combinations. He had entry to the house while David was missing. He had methodically destroyed the evidence before I could even think to look for it. I stood in the dim light of the basement vault, realized the true scale of the conspiracy. I was completely alone in a massive house with an imposter who possessed all the keys, all the codes, and all the power. If I made one mistake, I would become just a mystery in the Vance family history. I picked up the binder, placed it back in the safe, closed the steel door, and wiped away my fingerprints. I had to get out of the house immediately. By 10:30 a.m., I was driving frantically through the dirty gray slush of downtown Boston, heading straight to Beacon Forensic Laboratories, a high-tier genetic testing facility where my family's charitable foundation held a major seat on the board. The windshield wipers clicked rhythmically, a mocking sound that matched the frantic beating of my heart. I clutched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. In my coat pocket were the 2 plastic bags containing the hair samples. I bypassed the main reception area, ignored the administrative assistants, walked straight past the high-tech security barriers, and entered the private office of Dr. Marcus, a close personal friend and leading forensic expert who had handled the family's medical assessments for years. "What are you doing here without an appointment?" Dr. Marcus asked, looking up from his computer screen with surprise. "You look pale. Is everything all right with David's recovery?" I closed the office door behind me and locked it. I walked over to his desk and placed the 2 plastic bags on the dark wood. "I need an expedited, completely confidential DNA profiling done on these samples, Marcus," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I don't want this entered into the public database. I don't want anyone in the lab to know who these belong to. Use your private terminal." Dr. Marcus looked at the bags, then up at my face, recognizing the sheer desperation in my eyes. "Clara, this is highly unusual. Is this a legal matter for the firm?" "It's a matter of life and death, Marcus. Please. I need a 24 loci STR profile between these 2 samples. And I need it before the day ends." He hesitated for a moment, seeing the terror radiating off me, before slowly nodding. "Okay. Give me 5 hours. I'll run it under a blind security profile." Those 5 hours in the sterile, white waiting room of the lab were a slow, agonizing descent into purgatory. I couldn't sit still. I paced the floor, watching the snow turn into a dirty gray muck on the city streets outside. Every tick of the wall clock felt like an active detonation inside my skull. I thought about the man in my house, playing with my son, signing away millions of dollars, sleeping in my husband's bed. Who was he? Where was the real David? Was he murdered in the mountains of Alaska? At exactly 4:15 p.m., the heavy security door of the inner lab buzzed open. Dr. His face was entirely devoid of color, his laboratory coat hanging loosely on his shoulders as if he had aged 10 years in a matter of hours. He didn't say a single word. He simply gestured for me to enter his private, soundproof office and closed the door behind us. He walked to his desk, his hands trembling slightly, and slid a single sheet of paper across the dark wood. My eyes raced down the technical charts of alleles and genetic loci data, completely ignoring the complex medical jargon, until they landed on the bolded, undeniable conclusion at the very bottom of the page: relationship probability, 0% conclusion. The allelic data confirms an absolute lack of a direct, first-degree paternal relationship. The adult male is not the biological father of the child. The bomb had exploded. The paper shook in my hands. The imposter was legally, scientifically, a total stranger to my son. The man in my home was a monster wearing a human mask. But before I could collapse into tears or scream from the horror of it, Dr. Marcus leaned across the desk, his voice dropping into a somber, terrifying whisper. "Clara, there is something far more terrifying on that report. Look at the secondary analysis." I was confused by the facial structure similarities, so I cross-referenced this imposter's profile with an old, encrypted medical insurance backup of David's DNA that we stored on our private server 5 years ago, a file they forgot to purge from our system. "Clara, their genetic architecture is a 99.9% match. This man isn't a random stranger who got plastic surgery. Their DNA is identical." I looked at him, my mind spinning into chaos. "Identical? What do you mean identical, Marcus?" "That's impossible." "It's only possible if they are identical twins," Marcus whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "David has an identical twin brother." The drive back to the beak of flashing traffic lights and falling snow. My mind was racing through the dark history of the Vance family, digging up secrets that had been buried deep in the shadows for over a decade. David had an older identical twin brother named Thomas. I had only heard his name mentioned once, in a bitter whisper by David's late mother on her deathbed. Thomas had been the brilliant, unstable golden child of the family, a man whose intellect was rivaled only by his capacity for cruelty and greed. 10 years ago, long before I met David, Thomas had orchestrated a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate fraud scandal that nearly destroyed the family's hedge fund. When the federal authorities closed in, the family used their immense wealth and political connections to cover up the crime, banishing Thomas from the country and declaring him legally dead after a mysterious boating accident in Europe to save the family name from public ruin. David took over the empire, deleting every photograph, every document, and every memory of his brother from the family archives. Thomas became a ghost, an urban legend within the financial elite. But he hadn't died. He had been waiting in the shadows for 10 long years, watching David live the life that he believed belonged to him. He had watched David marry me, build a fortune, and raise a son. He had waited for the perfect moment to execute his final, terrifying retribution. And the Alaskan wilderness plane crash hadn't been an accident. It had been the perfect trap. I parked the car at the entrance of the estate, my body numb with a mixture of fear and cold rage. The trap was set, but Thomas didn't realize that I now held the key to his destruction. I took my phone out of my bag, dialed the direct number for Detective Harris at the Boston Police Department, a man who owed my family his career. "Harris," I said, my voice dropping into a cold. "I have the proof. The man in my house is an imposter, and he is a murderer. I need a tactical team at the Vance estate in exactly 30 minutes. Stay outside until you hear the signal from my open line. I am going to walk into the dining Room with my phone broadcasting live. Do not move until he confesses. Mrs. Vance, this is highly dangerous, Harris warned over the static of the line. If he realizes you know, he will kill you. He won't realize anything until it's too late, I said, cutting off the call. I kept the line open, slipping the phone into the deep pocket of my heavy winter coat, ensuring the microphone was clear. I stepped out of the car, walking toward the grand front doors of the mansion. The final confrontation had begun. 6:30 p.m. The grand estate was dead quiet, wrapped in a suffocating atmosphere. Winter twilight settled over the snowy suburbs. The classical music was gone, replaced by the low, mournful howling of the wind against the thick glass windows. The impostor, Thomas, was sitting alone at the head of the long mahogany dining table. The chandelier above him was dimmed, casting long, dramatic shadows across his face. He was calmly swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon, completely relaxed, effortlessly scrolling through financial documents on his tablet as if he were the rightful king of this empire. I walked into the dining room, deliberately keeping my heavy winter coat on, covered in melting, wet snow. I didn't take off my gloves. I walked straight to the head of the table, my boots clicking loudly against the marble floor. I stopped right next to his chair, pulled the white sheet of forensic DNA paper from my pocket, flattened the report on the dark wood, and slid it forcefully across the table until it slammed on glass. Thomas Nwang Mai, a slow, arrogant expression on his face. He didn't look at me. He slowly picked up the paper, holding it under the dim light of the chandelier. I watched his face with the intensity of a predator watching its prey. The human anatomy cannot hide a confession when hit with absolute, undeniable scientific truth. In a split second, I saw his eyes freeze as they hit the text at the bottom. The muscle in his jaw locked instantly. The sophisticated, calm facade of the wealthy tycoon completely evaporated, revealing the cold, vicious monster underneath. The air in the room turned to ice. Where the hell did you get this?" he stammered, his voice dropping into a frantic, low-pitched gasp, his throat tightening as he stared at the 0% paternity match. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice cutting through the silent room like a razor. "The DNA match is an absolute 0% with Leo. But you are a 99.9% match to David. You are Thomas, aren't you? The older twin brother who was banished from this family and declared dead 10 years ago after your corporate fraud scandal." A suffocating, heavy silence paralyzed the entire room. Thomas sat perfectly still for 10 long seconds, his eyes darting across the forensic charts. And then, a terrifying, deeply twisted smile slowly broke across his face. The fear vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, sadistic amusement. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, swirled his dark wine, and began to clap his hands slowly, mockingly, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "Grace, oh, Clara, you really are as brilliant as David said you were," Thomas said, his voice dropping its imitation of David's cadence, returning to his own sharp tone. "Yes, it's me. It's Thomas. The rightful heir to this entire godforsaken legacy. Do you have any idea what it's like to spend 10 years rotting in the shadows of Europe while my weak, pathetic little brother lived my life? He took my firm. He took my fortune. He took everything that my intellect built." He took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes locking onto mine with terrifying malice. "When David's corporate jet went down in the mountains of Alaska, it wasn't a twist of fate, Clara. My private security team located the wreckage days before the federal authorities even knew where to look. I flew out there myself. I stood over my dying twin brother as he lay pinned beneath that twisted, burning metal in the ice. He looked up at me, begging for help, crying like a child." Thomas leaned forward, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling. I looked him in the eyes, and I watched the light fade out of his soul. I didn't help him. I ended his suffering, squeezed the throat until he stopped breathing, and then I took his wedding band off his cold finger. I took his passport, his clothes, and I left his flesh to rot in the Alaskan ice. I came back to Boston to claim what was always mine, the firm, the fortune, and his beautiful wife. He stood up violently from his chair, the heavy mahogany wood screeching loudly against the floor. He lunged toward me across the table, his fingers clawing at the air, his eyes wild with sudden, manic rage. But you just couldn't leave it alone, could you, Clara? You had to go digging in the trash. You know too much now. You and this pathetic piece of forensic paper are going to disappear into the historic blizzard tonight, and no one will ever find your body. Before his finger the fabric of my winter coat, before he could take a single step around the table, the heavy, historic mahogany doors of the grand dining room were shattered open with a deafening crash. Federal agents. Nobody move. Put your hands on your head. 24 heavily armed tactical officers from the Boston Police Department, flanked by federal prosecutors and FBI agents, stormed into the dining room. Their laser sights painted red dots across Thomas's chest and face. They didn't hesitate. They tackled him to the floor, slamming his face first onto the hard marble, throwing his arms behind his back into heavy iron cuffs. Thomas screamed, cursing and struggling against the weight of the officers, his elegant suit tearing as they pinned him down. You have nothing. You can't prove anything. I am David Vance. From my deep coat pocket, I slowly pulled out my phone. It was still illuminated, displaying the active, real-time audio broadcast to Detective Harris and the federal prosecutors that had been running since I stepped out of my car. Every single word of his twisted confession, the murder of his brother in the Alaskan wilderness, the identity theft, the corporate fraud, and his threat to kill me, had been recorded and logged into the federal evidence server. It's over, Thomas, I said, looking down at him as he lay in cuffs on the floor, his face smeared with dirt and his own wine. The code of life doesn't lie, and neither does a federal wiretap. As they hauled him out into the freezing, dark night, Thomas looked back at me, his eyes filled with a terrifying, silent promise of revenge. But he was going to a place where his family's wealth and connections could never reach him, a federal maximum security facility for the rest of his natural life without the possibility of parole. The subsequent federal and forensic excavation in the remote mountains of Alaska succeeded its frozen remains from the deep ice. The autopsy confirmed the throat trauma Thomas had confessed to on the recording. David was finally brought home to Boston, vindicated, his name cleared of the fraud Thomas had attempted to commit in his name, and given a proper, honorable burial in the private family plot. Now, I stand completely alone on the grand marble balcony of our Beacon Hill estate, watching the fresh, pure snow blanket the courtyard below, slowly erasing every single footprint, every memory of the monster who walked through these halls. I protected my son, I secured absolute justice for my late husband, and I took sole, undisputed control of the Vance hedge fund empire as the rightful matriarch. This historic mansion remains magnificent, an architectural marvel of wealth and power, but the master bedroom will forever remain empty. The perfect, enviable marriages of the elite are often just fragile, beautiful illusions, a gilded cage where the most dangerous the exact face of the ones we love most. Here at Family Truths, the truth always finds its way out of the shadows, no matter how deep it is buried beneath the snow.